August 1943. Clarkfield, Philippines. The heat is suffocating. Even at night, the air feels heavy, thick with humidity. Most soldiers are asleep. The base is quiet. But at the far edge of the airfield, inside an abandoned maintenance tent, a light is still on. Inside, Sergeant Edgar Wiltshire is breaking the rules. Completely. Spread across wooden tables are dismantled radio units, loose wires, vacuum tubes, and hand-drawn diagrams. Tools are scattered everywhere. Nothing about this looks official, because it isn't. This isn't a military lab. It's a secret one, and if anyone with authority walks in right now, his career is over, maybe worse. Wiltshire leans over a partially disassembled SCR 522 radio, carefully removing a vacuum tube and holding it up to the dim light. To most technicians, this is just another component. To him, this might be the key to everything. For weeks, he had been running quiet, unauthorized tests, not following manuals, not following procedures. Instead, he followed one simple idea: recreate the conditions where radios fail. Because that was the one thing official testing never did. On the ground, radios worked perfectly, so the Army assumed they were fine. But the real problem didn't happen on the ground. It happened at 30,000 feet in extreme cold, under pressure, over hours of flight. So, Wiltshire asked himself a dangerous question. What if the tests are wrong? His first experiments were crude. He exposed radios to heat. Signals distorted. Then he cooled them using improvised methods. Ice, metal containers, whatever he could find. Something strange happened. Different failures appeared. Not random, but consistent. That was the moment everything changed. He realized something no one else had proven. These radios weren't failing. They were changing. Their internal components were behaving differently under extreme temperature. And the longer they stayed in those conditions, the worse it became. His attention quickly locked onto one specific component, the VT-132 vacuum tube, a small, fragile glass device. But inside the radio, it played a critical role. It amplified signals. Without it, communication collapsed. On paper, every VT-132 tube met Army standards. Everyone had passed inspection. Everyone was considered reliable. But Wiltshire didn't trust paper. He trusted results. So he built something completely unconventional. A testing system no manual described. Using scrap materials, he constructed a crude cooling chamber, a wooden box packed with ice and salvage parts. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't precise. But it did one thing perfectly. It simulated the freezing conditions of high altitude. One by one, he began testing the tubes. Each tube spent 30 minutes in the cold chamber. Then he tested its electrical performance. At first, the results seemed normal. Then the pattern appeared. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Some tubes worked perfectly. Others didn't. Not immediately. But under cold conditions, their performance dropped. Signals weakened, distorted, collapsed, exactly like the pilots described. Wiltshire increased the sample size. 50 tubes, 100 tubes, 200 tubes. The results were undeniable. Out of 200 tubes, 67 failed. Not in theory, not in simulations, in real measurable tests. And here's the most terrifying part. Every single one of those defective tubes had already passed official Army inspection. They were approved. They were being installed in combat aircraft. They were already flying missions. Wiltshire leaned back, staring at his notes. The implication hit him hard. This wasn't a small issue. This wasn't a rare defect. This was systemic. Hundreds, maybe thousands of aircraft radios were carrying hidden failures. Failures that would only appear at high altitude. Failures that would strike at the worst possible moment. For a moment, the tent felt silent, not peaceful. Heavy, because now he understood something no one else did. Pilots weren't dying because of bad luck. They were dying because the system meant protect them couldn't detect its own flaws. But knowing the truth was only the beginning. Because now came the real challenge, convincing the Army. The next morning, Wiltshire reported his findings. Confident, focused, certain that the evidence would speak for itself. It didn't. Captain James Morrison, his commanding officer, barely let him finish. "You're not authorized to conduct independent testing," Morrison said sharply. "Your job is maintenance, not experimentation." Wiltshire tried to explain, tried to show the data, tried to make him understand. But the answer didn't change. Rules are rules. Procedures exist for a reason, and a sergeant doesn't rewrite them. But the situation got worse. Much worse. When Major Robert Hayes learned about the secret experiments, he didn't just dismiss them. He saw them as a threat. Wiltshire was summoned immediately. The atmosphere in the office was cold, controlled, dangerous. "Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice sharp and precise, "unauthorized modification and testing of military equipment constitutes destruction of government property." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Your actions could lead to court-martial." In that moment, everything became real. This wasn't just about radios anymore. This was about his career, his future, his freedom. Wiltshire stood still, silent, but inside his mind was racing, because he knew something they didn't. Every day this problem remained unsolved. More missions would fail. More bombers would be lost. More pilots would die, not because they were outmatched, but because they couldn't communicate. He had two choices: walk away, follow orders, forget everything he had discovered, or keep pushing, keep risking everything for something bigger than himself. For Wiltshire, the choice wasn't complicated. It was inevitable. That night, he returned to the tent, turned the light back on, picked up another tube, and continued testing. Because now it wasn't just curiosity driving him. It was responsibility. He wasn't just fixing radios anymore. He was trying to stop a silent killer in the sky. And soon, his work would force the entire military to make a decision they could no longer avoid. The question was no longer whether he was right. The question was whether the Army was willing to admit it. October 14th, 1943. 35,000 feet above Nazi Germany. A sky filled with engines and silence. Captain Robert Johnson tightens his grip on the controls of his P-47 Thunderbolt as it slices through the freezing air. Around him, the sky is alive. Hundreds of American aircraft stretching in every direction. Massive B-17 bombers fly in tight formation, guarded by dozens of fighters like his. This isn't just another mission. This is a gamble that could change the war. Their target lies deep inside enemy territory, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. These factories are the beating heart of Hitler's war machine. Destroy them, and you cripple Nazi production. Fail, and the cost will be catastrophic. Johnson exhales slowly and presses the transmit button. Blue flight. Report status. He waits. Nothing. No voices. No confirmations. Only static, dry, lifeless static. He adjusts the frequency. Tries again. Blue flight, come in. Still nothing. Around him, nearly 50 other P-47 Thunderbolts hold formation perfectly, but inside their cockpits, every pilot is facing the same terrifying reality. Their radios are dead. At 35,000 feet, silence isn't just uncomfortable. It's deadly, because in the sky over Germany, survival depends on coordination. Without communication, fighter pilots cannot warn bombers about incoming attacks. Squadron leaders cannot direct formations. And worst of all, no one can call for help. The numbers behind this problem are chilling. During high-altitude missions, more than 60% of American fighter radios fail completely. Bomber formations that maintain communication suffer losses around 23%. But when radios fail, casualties skyrocket to nearly 67%. That's not just a technical issue. That's a death sentence. And right now, Captain Johnson is flying straight into it. Far below, hidden in clouds and shadows, German fighters are already climbing. They are waiting for the moment when American formations break apart, when confusion replaces coordination, when silence creates opportunity. Because they know something the Americans are only beginning to understand. A bomber without communication is a target. But what Captain Johnson doesn't know, what almost no one in the skies over Europe understands, is that the answer to this deadly mystery has already begun to emerge. not in a high-tech laboratory, not in the offices of top engineers, but nearly 8,000 miles away, in a hot, humid maintenance tent in the Pacific, 3 months earlier, Philippines. Inside a cramped tent lit by a flickering lamp, an Army sergeant wipes sweat from his forehead as he stares at a disassembled radio spread across a wooden table. His name is Edgar Wiltshire. He is not a famous engineer. He is not a scientist. In fact, he isn't even supposed to be solving this problem. Just weeks ago, his job was simple: repair radios, follow procedures, and keep aircraft operational. But something didn't add up. Again and again, pilots reported the same issue. On the ground, radios worked perfectly. At low altitude, they were reliable. But once aircraft climbed above 25,000 feet, everything started to fail. Signals became weak. Voices turned distorted. Then suddenly, silence. Official explanations were already in place. Experts blamed atmospheric interference, solar radiation, ionospheric disturbances, complex theories, scientific language, convincing but incomplete, because to Wiltshire, something felt wrong. These failures weren't random. They followed a pattern. And patterns mean one thing: there's a cause. Ignoring military protocol, Wiltshire began asking questions no one else was asking. Instead of trusting manuals, he trusted observation. Instead of accepting theories, he looked for evidence. And slowly, a dangerous idea began to form in his mind. What if the problem wasn't outside the radio? What if it was inside, back in Europe? The consequences of that unanswered question were already unfolding. Bomber missions were turning into disasters. Colonel Curtis LeMay had seen it firsthand. In one report, he described a mission where radio contact was lost at 30,000 feet. Without warning, German fighters attacked. 15 bombers were shot down. 150 airmen gone, not because of poor flying, not because of weak strategy, but because no one could talk to each other. The U.S. Army responded with everything it had. Top scientists from Bell Labs ran tests. General Electric analyzed power systems. RCA examined antenna designs. Every result came back the same. The radios were perfect. On paper, nothing was wrong. And yet in the sky, everything was failing. This led to a terrifying conclusion. Fixing the problem would require an entirely new generation of radios. Time required, at least 3 years. Cost, over $200 million. Time the war simply did not have. So commanders faced an impossible choice: continue missions and accept massive losses, or stop bombing altogether, and let Nazi industry grow stronger. Meanwhile, in his small tent in the Philippines, Edgar Wiltshire was reaching a very different conclusion. He didn't have advanced equipment. He didn't have a team of engineers. But he had something far more powerful: curiosity. Night after night, he worked alone, taking radios apart, testing components, rebuilding them piece by piece. He ignored regulations, ignored the risk of punishment, because every failed radio meant something very real. Pilots dying in the sky. Then one day, everything changed. During a conversation with an experienced pilot, Wiltshire heard a detail that no report had emphasized. The failure wasn't sudden. It was gradual. First, the signal weakened. Then it faded in and out. And finally, it disappeared. That detail hit him like a shock, because random interference doesn't behave like that. But a failing component does. At that moment, Wiltshire realized something that thousands of experts had missed. This wasn't an atmospheric problem. This wasn't caused by the sun or the sky or radio waves. This was something far more dangerous. Something hidden. Something inside the radio itself. Slowly breaking down under extreme conditions. And if he was right, then every aircraft flying at high altitude was carrying a hidden failure, waiting for the worst possible moment. Back in his tent, Wiltshire stared at the components in front of him. Wires, circuits, vacuum tubes. Somewhere in this machine was the truth, and he was about to risk everything to find it. September 15th, 1943. Clark Field Headquarters. A long wooden table. 5 senior officers. And at the far end, 1 sergeant. Edgar Wiltshire sits alone, his hands resting calmly in front of him, but the room around him is anything but calm. This isn't officially a trial, but it feels like one, because what happens here will decide everything. Major Robert Hayes opens a meeting, his tone cold and controlled. Sergeant Wiltshire, he begins, you conducted unauthorized testing of military equipment. That is a direct violation of Army regulations. A pause. Explain yourself. The room falls silent. Every eye is on him. This is the moment where most soldiers would apologize, step back, fall in line. Wiltshire doesn't. Sir, he says steadily, I believe I have identified the cause of high-altitude radio failures. No hesitation. No fear in his voice. Just certainty. Some officers exchange glances. Others remain skeptical. Colonel James Bradley leans back slightly, studying him. You're aware, Bradley says slowly, that the Army Signal Corps employs thousands of trained engineers to solve these problems? Wiltshire nods. Yes, sir. Then what makes you think, Bradley continues, that your method is more accurate than theirs? Before Wiltshire can answer, another voice cuts in. Captain William Chun, the group's technical officer. Sharper, more aggressive. The VT-132 tubes you claim are defective, Chun says, have already passed inspection by qualified personnel. He leans forward. On what authority do you question their judgment? The pressure in the room builds. This isn't just a discussion anymore. This is a challenge. A test. Wiltshire doesn't argue. He doesn't raise his voice. Instead, he reaches forward and slides a thick folder across the table. Inside, weeks of data, handwritten notes, temperature logs, performance charts, serial numbers, every experiment recorded, every result documented. At first, the officers flip through casually. Then, slowly, their expressions change. Graphs show something impossible to ignore. Signal strength dropping under cold conditions. Amplification curves collapsing over time. Patterns, clear, consistent, repeatable. But the most important detail is this. Each failure connects directly to specific VT-132 tubes. Not random, not atmospheric, internal. Wiltshire speaks again, calm but firm. Sir, these failures are not caused by external interference. He points to a chart. They are caused by internal component degradation under extreme temperature. The room is quieter now, but not convinced. Not yet. Major Hayes folds his arms. Even if your theory is correct, he says, you still violated regulations. His voice hardens. There are proper channels for this kind of work. The tension rises again, because now this isn't about science. It's about authority. For a brief moment, it looks like the discussion will end right there. Dismissed, ignored, buried under procedure. Then, Wiltshire reveals the final piece. He slides one more document forward. This one is different. Not theory, not lab data. Real-world results. A comparison report. Aircraft, missions, radio failures. Every plane that experienced radio failure had VT-132 tubes that failed as cold test. Every plane that didn't fail had tubes that passed. No exceptions. The room goes completely silent, because this changes everything. This isn't just a theory anymore. This is proof. Captain Morrison shakes his head, almost in disbelief. You're suggesting, he says slowly, that our entire quality control system is missing critical defects. Wiltshire meets his eyes. Yes, sir. The words hang in the air. Heavy, uncomfortable, dangerous. Because if he's right, then the system is broken. And admitting that means admitting responsibility. The argument begins. Voices rise. Officers debate back and forth. Some defend procedure. Others question it. This sets a dangerous precedent. We can't let enlisted personnel rewrite testing standards. But the data is clear. We don't even know if this is scalable. The room turns chaotic until a new voice cuts through the noise. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Austin, recently arrived from Europe, where the problem is killing men every day. Gentlemen, he says quietly, radio failure rates in the European theater are approaching 60% above 30,000 feet. The room stills. He looks directly at Colonel Bradley. If this method works. A pause. We don't have the luxury of ignoring it. Silence again. But this time, it's different. Then unexpectedly, a pilot stands. Captain Donald Richards. 43 combat missions. A man who has seen what failure looks like in the sky. I've lost wingmen because of radio failure, he says. No emotion, just truth. Yesterday, he continues, a pilot died because we couldn't coordinate. He looks around the room, at every officer. If this sergeant can fix our radios. A pause. I don't care how he did it. That's it. No argument can beat that, because this is no longer about rules. It's about lives. Colonel Bradley raises his hand. The room falls silent. He looks at Wiltshire, then at the reports, then at the officers around him. When he speaks, his voice is calm, decisive. American airmen are dying because their radios fail. A pause. Sergeant Wiltshire claims he can prevent that. Another pause, longer this time. The question is not whether his methods follow procedure. He leans forward slightly. The question is whether they save lives. No one interrupts. No one argues. Because everyone in the room knows this is the turning point. Colonel Bradley straightens. Decision made. Sergeant Wiltshire, he says, you are authorized to implement your testing procedures. The words land like a shockwave. All VT-132 tubes will undergo your cold temperature screening before installation. Some officers look stunned, others relieved. Results will be monitored for 30 days. And just like that, everything changes. In that moment, the United States Army makes one of the most unconventional decisions in its history. It trusts a young sergeant with an art degree over its own system. But the real test hasn't begun yet, because proving a theory in a room is one thing. Proving it in the sky, under enemy fire, is something else entirely. October 2nd, 1943. Clark Field. No speeches, no celebrations, just work. Inside the same maintenance tent where everything began, Sergeant Edgar Wiltshire starts something the Army has never done before. A full-scale component screening program. Every single VT-132 vacuum tube scheduled for installation is now stopped. Tested, one by one. The process is simple. Brutally simple. Each tube is placed inside his improvised cold chamber, left there for 30 minutes, then tested for performance. According to Army standards, this step is unnecessary. The tubes have already passed inspection. They're already approved. But Wiltshire ignores that, because now he knows something the system doesn't. Passing a standard test doesn't mean surviving real conditions. The first week alone changes everything. 847 tubes tested. 312 fail. Not damaged. Not broken. Just not good enough for high altitude. That means over 1/3 of approved components would have failed in combat. And now, for the first time, they never get the chance. New radios are assembled, tested tubes only, installed carefully into P-47 Thunderbolts. Pilots begin to notice something strange. They don't know the technical details. They don't see the testing, but they feel the difference. Flights begin, climbing higher, 25,000 feet, 28,000, 30,000. Normally, this is where it starts. The signal weakens. Voices break. Static creeps in. But this time, nothing happens. No distortion. No fading. No silence. Just clear, steady communication. At first, pilots think it's luck. Then coincidence. Then something else. They start asking for specific aircraft, planes with the tested radios. Soon, those radios get a name. Not official. Not written anywhere. Pilots start calling them Wiltshire tubes. Because for the first time in months, at 30,000 feet, they can hear each other. But tests on base aren't enough. There's only one place that matters. Combat. November 8th, 1943. A real mission. Real danger. Captain William Dunham leads 12P 47 Thunderbolts. Their task: escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Altitude climbed steadily, 32,000 feet, then higher, 34,000 feet. The exact zone where radios always fail. Inside his cockpit, Dunham knows the pattern. He's lived it. He's heard the silence. So at 8:47 a.m., he presses the transmit button. Blue flight, report status. He waits. In the past, this is where everything would disappear. But not today. Blue 1, loud and clear. Blue 2, reading you. Blue 3, good signal. One by one, all 12 pilots respond. Clear, strong, perfect. Dunham freezes for a moment, not from fear, from realization. It worked. For the first time, a full formation reaches high altitude without losing communication. But the real test comes minutes later. 9:03 a.m. Enemy fighters appear, diving fast, aggressive. In previous missions, this is where chaos begins. No communication, no coordination. Every pilot on his own. But this time, something is different. Dunham's voice cuts through the radio. Brake left, defensive positions. Instant response. Every fighter moves. Perfect timing. Perfect coordination. Pilots cover each other. Shift positions. React as one unit. The German attack collapses. They cannot break through. They cannot isolate bombers. They cannot exploit confusion. Because there is none. The bombers continue forward, untouched, not a single loss. After the mission, Dunham writes a report. Simple, direct, powerful. Radio communication remained operational throughout the mission at 35,000 feet. 0 equipment failures. Then the line that changes everything. Recommend immediate implementation across all units. But one mission isn't enough. The Army needs proof, undeniable proof. And 2 weeks later, they get it. November 23rd, 1943. A larger operation. 48 P-47 fighters. But this time, it becomes an accidental experiment. Half the aircraft use standard tubes. Half use Wiltshire-tested tubes. Same mission, same altitude, same enemy. Perfect comparison. As the formation climbs above 28,000 feet, it begins. Exactly as predicted, the standard group loses communication. Radios fade. Signals die. 24 fighters. Cut off. Alone. And when enemy fighters attack, the result is brutal. No coordination. No warning. No defense structure. 3 aircraft shot down. 7 more damaged. Meanwhile, the other 24 fighters stay connected. Every command heard. Every movement coordinated. They fight as a single unit. Result? 0 losses. Not 1 aircraft destroyed. The difference is undeniable. Not skill. Not luck. Communication. Within weeks, everything changes. Before Wiltshire's method, radio failure rate, 67%. After implementation, less than 8%. That's not improvement. That's transformation. Pilots who once expected silence now trust their radios. Missions that once ended in chaos now operate with precision. And for the first time, high-altitude combat becomes controlled. News spreads fast, through the Pacific, then beyond. Commanders take notice. General George Kenney himself arrives to observe. He watches the tests, reviews the data, sees the results. His conclusion is immediate. This solved the problem. Orders are issued. Wiltshire's method is no longer an experiment. It becomes standard across the entire Pacific Air Force. And soon, requests begin arriving from Europe because over Nazi Germany, the problem is even worse. And now, they finally have the solution. But what no one realizes yet is just how big this discovery really is. Because this isn't just about fixing radios. This is about saving lives. On a scale no one has calculated yet. The orders move fast, from the Pacific to Europe, from small maintenance tents to massive air bases preparing missions over Nazi Germany. Because now, commanders finally had something they didn't have before, a solution. In England, where American bombers faced the deadliest defenses of the war, radio failure wasn't just a problem, it was a nightmare. Escort fighters would lose contact, formations would break, bombers would be left exposed, and German interceptors were waiting, always waiting. But now, every VT, 132 tube, will be tested, every weak component removed, every radio prepared for the reality of high-altitude combat. The change didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it was undeniable. Missions that once collapsed into chaos now stayed connected. Fighter escorts coordinated perfectly. Bombers held formation. Pilots responded instantly to threats. And slowly, the numbers began to change. Radio reliability, once hovering around 30% to 40% in extreme conditions, jumped to over 90%. That one improvement triggered everything else. Better coordination, better defense, fewer losses. What once looked like an unavoidable weakness was gone. Enemy pilots noticed it too. Japanese and German reports began describing something unusual. American fighters, more organized, more precise, harder to defeat. They didn't know why. They couldn't see the change. Because it wasn't in the aircraft design. It wasn't in new weapons. It was something invisible. Communication. What used to be silence was now control. And in war, that changes everything. As months passed, the impact grew larger than anyone expected. Thousands of missions were flown using Wiltshire's method. Bombers penetrated deeper into enemy territory. Fighter escorts stayed effective at extreme altitude. And most importantly, more men came back. By the time the war ended, the numbers told a story no one could ignore. More than 23,000 combat missions benefited directly from the improved radio reliability. And military analysts estimated something even more powerful. Up to 8,400 American airmen may have been saved, not by a new weapon, not by a new aircraft, but by fixing a problem no one else truly understood. Even more shocking, during wartime production, over 2.3 million VT-132 tubes were manufactured using Wiltshire's testing method. Nearly 847,000 effective tubes were identified. That's hundreds of thousands of hidden failures, removed before they could cost lives. The overall reliability of aircraft communication systems improved by more than 300%, a silent revolution. And yet, the man behind it remained almost invisible. No headlines, no fame, just a sergeant who refused to accept that failure had no solution. After the war, military leaders finally began to recognize what had happened. General Curtis LeMay, one of the architects of the bombing campaigns, acknowledged the truth. Without reliable communication, bomber missions would have suffered unacceptable losses. Wiltshire's work didn't just improve performance. It made those missions possible. And his influence didn't end with the war. What he discovered inside that small maintenance tent became a standard. Today, every military aircraft, every advanced system, every critical electronic component is tested under extreme environmental conditions, temperature, pressure, stress, because now we know. Passing a test isn't enough. It has to survive reality. Modern aircraft like the F-35 still follow principles born from that discovery. Technicians still test components the same way, not just for function, but for endurance. All because one man asked a simple question. What if the problem isn't what we think it is? Edgar Wiltshire lived long enough to see the impact of his work. He didn't become a celebrity. He didn't seek recognition. But he knew that thousands of men had returned home because their radios worked when it mattered most. Because someone refused to follow the easy answer. Because someone chose to question the system. And in the middle of a global war, that choice made all the difference. The real lesson of his story isn't just about technology. It's about mindset. Because sometimes the biggest breakthroughs don't come from experts or massive laboratories or billion-dollar projects. Sometimes they come from one person working alone, asking the right question, and refusing to stop until they find the answer. And in this case, that answer didn't just solve a problem. It saved lives, changed warfare, and turned silence in the sky into a voice that brought men home.